It's time to mingle. I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. I want to recommend a new book, currently the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Anxious Generation, written by Jonathan Haidt, who'll be here in just a moment. He joins a long list of radio and TV guests of mine who've written books that read individually are interesting, but collectively they fit together like pieces of a puzzle, and they project an alarming finished picture. We're replacing real-life human encounters that produce meaningful relationships with inch-deep online connections. It's poisoning our politics and harming our kids. Robert Putnam saw it coming in 2000 when he published Bowling Alone. Putnam said that a community's level of social capital is determined by relationships forged when we join clubs, associate with our neighbors, read local newspapers, and yes, join a bowling league. He offered suggestions on reconnecting with family and friends and neighbors. 5 years later, and still 2 years before the release of the iPhone, Richard Louv published Last Child in the Woods. Louv's focus was on child rearing and encouraged unstructured play. He said it was unhealthy to raise children disconnected from the natural outdoor world. 3 years later, it was Bill Bishop's turn with The Big Sort. Bishop said that we disengaged as a society after Vietnam, and that when we re-engaged in the internet era, it was along far more narrow lines of interest, making it easier to associate with the like-minded, including on matters of politics. Lenore Skenazy published Free Range Kids 1 year later. You might remember when she made headlines after allowing her 9-year-old to ride the New York City subway alone. She has since championed the Let Grow movement. She hit many of the same themes as Richard Louv. Enter Charles Murray, who published Coming Apart in 2012, wherein he focused on the result of a growing divide between the upper and working class. Murray advanced themes similar to Robert Putnam. He said that when the better off live in secluded, gated communities like, say, Belmont, Massachusetts, they're removed from the poor of Kensington in Philadelphia, and the less fortunate suffer opportunity loss. 5 years later, it was Jean Twangy's turn with iGen. Twangy studies generational divide. She observed that 2012 marked the year when more than half of America had cell phones, and noted that it was also the year that Facebook acquired Instagram, the beginning of the selfie era. Twangy said that when adolescents' social lives moved online onto smartphones, mental health plummeted. And affirming Twangy's mental health observations, last year the CDC released an alarming report based on a survey of 17,000 American high school students. I interviewed Kathleen Ethier, the CDC's study director. She told me that in 30 years of collecting similar data, they'd never seen anything like it. 42% of American high school students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. 24% of American high school girls have actually made a suicide plan. A prescription for what ails us came last year in the form of yet another book, The Good Life, by Harvard psychiatrist Robert Waldinger and psychologist Mark Scholes. They described the longest scientific study of happiness ever conducted. The conclusion? Good relationships keep us happier, healthier, and help us live longer. People satisfied in relationships at age 50 were the healthiest mentally and physically at age 80. Only as a society, we're going in the opposite direction. I've interviewed all of these authors and more. You can find every one of the interviews on my website posted under the Mingle Project. Click on the book jacket, listen to the interview. There's a consistency to the work, a common thread to all of these findings. We're having too many specialized interactions, usually online, and too few in-person common experiences. Internet-fueled self-sorting is hardening class division, it's reducing social mobility, it's falsely turning too many of us into political enemies. I see it as the most important issue of our time. We'll never solve anything consequential if we continue to fray as a society. Which brings me to Jonathan Haidt. The social psychologist from NYU is the author of the new book called The Anxious Generation. Haidt builds on all of the work that I've referenced. He says we've taught our kids that the real world is a dangerous place and we become overprotected, but we haven't extended those lessons to the virtual world. What's needed? Less supervision in the real world and more in the virtual world. I want to know what you think. Go to my website this hour and answer today's poll question at Smerconish.com. Agree or disagree, social media use does not just correlate with mental illness, it causes it. Jonathan Haidt joins me now. His previous books include The Coddling of the American Mind and The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Jonathan, so great to have you. Congrats on the success of the book. Why are you so sure as to the cause of adolescent angst where others point to climate change or political chaos or the economy or war?
Thanks so much for having me back on, Michael. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And boy, am I honored to be in that list. I love all those books that you mentioned.
Thank you.
There are so many things lining up to give us increasing confidence that social media, and it's more the phone-based childhood in general, is a cause, not just a correlate. The simplest reason is that adolescent mental health fell off a cliff in 2012 or 2013. There wasn't much sign of it in 2010, and it was really bad by 2015. And everyone has their theory as to why this might have happened in the United States. But why did the exact same thing happen in Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, to some extent in Scandinavia? So all these theories about, it was school shootings or it was something about American politics, they don't make any sense. Also, climate change wasn't really, when Greta Thunberg comes out in 2017 and 2018, if everything happened then I'd say, okay, climate change, that could be a cause for global alarm. But this all happens around 2013, and it's driven especially by preteen girls. I don't think that preteen girls were the main group that was going to be influenced by climate change. So there is no other alternative theory. There is no theory that the skeptics have proposed that fits the international data. That's the first thing.
I want you to respond to the criticism, the critique that was offered in Nature this week. I'll put it up on the screen and I'll read it aloud. This comes from Candace Odgers, who's a psychologist at UC Irvine. She says, 2 things need to be said after reading The Anxious Generation. First, this book is going to sell a lot of copies because Jonathan Haidt is telling a scary story about children's development that many parents are primed to believe, and this is the part I want you to respond to. Second, the book's repeated suggestion that digital technologies are rewiring our children's brains and causing an epidemic of mental illness is not supported by science. Worse, the bold proposal that social media is to blame might distract us from effectively responding to the real causes of the current mental health crisis. And by the way, in her piece, she points to the 2008 financial meltdown. What's your response?
Yeah. So once again, the financial meltdown makes no sense. That was 2008. Teen mental health was fine until 2012. And then it's girls, young girls, who get depressed so suddenly. So the timing makes no sense. As for her argument, her main argument in the essay is that I have mistaken correlation for causation. I'm a social scientist. I know that correlation doesn't imply correlation. Correlation does not imply causation. I've been in this debate since 2019. In 2019, there was a lot of correlational evidence showing that girls who spend a lot of time on social media are more mentally ill. That doesn't prove causation. At the time, there weren't a lot of experiments. Now there are. I've collected 25 experiments, 17 of which show a significant effect. Once we have experimental evidence and longitudinal studies and quasi-experiments where you look at what happens to a whole region when the internet comes in, high-speed internet comes in at different phases, the evidence keeps lining up and piling up. So for Odgers to say that she says there is no evidence, that's just wrong. I hope that listeners will go to my Substack, afterbabble.com. I have post after post where Zach Rausch and we lay out the international mental health data. We lay out the experimental data. It's not just correlational. There's now experimental evidence. There's evidence of many kinds. Oh, and eyewitness testimony. You ask the kids themselves, what do they think it is? They say it's social media. Meta did a study and they found this out, that the kids say Instagram is the worst. So to say that there's no evidence, that I have no evidence, just correlational studies, is just not true.
Here's the tightest encapsulation, I think, from The Anxious Generation. I'll put this on the screen and read aloud. These are your words. Gen Z is the first generation to have gone through puberty hunched over smartphones and tablets, having fewer face-to-face conversations and shoulder-to-shoulder adventures with their friends. As childhood was rewired, especially between 2010 and 2015, adolescents became more anxious, depressed, and fragile. In this new phone-based childhood, free play, attunement, and local models for social social learning are replaced by screen time, asynchronous interaction, and influencers chosen by algorithms. Children are, in a sense, deprived of childhood. That's it in a nutshell, right, Jonathan? What else would you say?
No, well, that's basically the story. I mean, basically, human beings had a play-based childhood from time immemorial. That's what all mammals do. We play to wire up our brains. And then between 2010 and 2015, phones and screens come sweeping in. Of course, they had computers and TV before then, but the smartphone allows them to have it with them all the time. The internet is with you all the time, and you can be online every moment or at least every hour. So things really change. I'd like listeners to imagine, I mean, here's Audra thinks that I'm making a very, very strong claim that needs very, very strong evidence. But imagine this claim. Suppose we invented a toy, let's call it the Furby or whatever, one of those things in the 80s. Suppose you learn that this Furby is going to take up about 9 hours a day of your child's time. They won't go outside much. They won't get as much sleep. They won't spend much time with friends. They won't play. They won't have hobbies. They won't read books. And then somebody proposes, maybe the Furbies will be bad for kids. Are you going to say, what a fantastical claim? Oh my God, how could that be? So, when you look at the massive rewiring of childhood into activities that are not particularly healthy, I mean, of course it has an effect. And my book shows is that there's all kinds of evidence supporting that claim.
Jonathan, tell me one thing parents can do.
The most important thing that parents can do is delay the age at which their child gets immersed in internet culture. We have to protect early puberty, especially that's middle school, ages 10 to 14. In that range, we must protect kids' brains in that age. That's when the maximum damage is done, especially for girls. So the most important thing you can do is delay the age at which you give your child a smartphone until high school, and delay social media until 16. And while these sound hard, if you're listening at home, these sound hard to do because your child's going to say, but then I'm the only one. Well, team up with others. Talk to the parents of your kids' friends. Talk to the school. If you do it together, you can break out of these traps.
Here's a social media reaction to our conversation and your book. Put it on the screen and keep Jonathan here so he can respond as well. There are a lot of factors, says Maureen, that contribute to mental health issues in children. Blaming social media for everything from climate change to kidnapping, the Lindbergh baby, only obscures solutions. Quick response from you, Jonathan Haidt.
Oh, sure. Of course, there's lots of causes. But when you get a global synchronized change around 2013, there's only one theory on the table, and that is the technological change. Nothing else fits. I'm not saying it's all that. I'm just saying this is the only thing that can explain the very rapid change in multiple countries.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay.
Remember, I want to know what you think. Go to my website at Smerconish.com. Answer today's poll question. Agree or disagree, social media use does not just correlate with mental illness, it causes it.